Hello everybody, it's Mobius Y here with another video for Stellaris Console Edition. So this video is the first of a few that I wanted to do for quite some time, about 6 months now, and it is a tier list. And I wanted to do some tier lists before we get 2.2 that are relevant and up to date with the current version of Console Edition. Yes, I will have to probably revise every single one of these quite heavily once we get 2.2 out, but that's okay, I'm willing to do that. At this point, I'm largely just releasing these for fun, and especially for players who still like to really min-max their Empire builds as much as possible. And for those of you who are still constantly playing, patiently waiting for the 2.2 update to come out later on in 2020. So this traits tier list, this is for species traits. It's the first of 3. I have 2 more, one for Empire Civics and one for Ascension perks. Those will be coming out on later dates in the very near future. If they're not out yet, please be patient. If they are out, I highly recommend giving those ones a watch as well. So there's going to be no gameplay in this particular video, and that will likely be extremely boring for a lot of people, but that's kind of the nature of things with these advanced kind of mechanics videos. Before we jump into this, I would like to give a big thank you to Stefan. He has his own YouTube channel called Stefan Anon. He uploads Stellaris PC content, so he's currently doing a lot of Stellaris 2.6 stuff, which is the update that came out around the same time as Federations. But I highly recommend checking out his guides on Stellaris 2.2. His channel is my personal go-to channel for studying up on how to play Stellaris and how to play it well. I do like to min-max just as much as I like to do goofy stuff and roleplay. So for those of you who like to play well and be effective every time you boot up a new game in Stellaris Console Edition, I highly recommend going out and checking Stefan Anon's channel. I will post a link in the description below. So, this traits tier list. This will be nothing unusual, as I've ranked everything in 6 different tiers. We have S, A, B, C, D, and F tier. Now, I'm going to probably do timestamps in the description, so you can click on those if you're looking for information on a specific tier. Or the traits in a specific tier, but also in the video I'm going to be using images where there's a big yellow box around the particular tier that I am discussing at the time. So keep an eye out for that to help you with navigation. So the traits tier list. I have ranked the traits based on their overall usefulness in all stages of the game, whether they get better or worse over time, their direct and indirect effects on your empire, and their cost in trait points. So all of those factors are considered and either are dependent on whether a trait is really good and ranked very high, or whether a trait is bad and ranked pretty low. So in S tier, we have great traits for any species regardless of empire build, useful from the beginning to the end of the game. So these are the creme de la creme. If you're trying to build an effective empire, these are your kind of go-to species traits. Or if you're modifying your species traits later on in the game, once you have some gene tailoring technology, these are your go-to traits. A tier, very good traits for any species regardless of empire build, without the same usefulness or positive effects as S tier. So these are still very good picks. Probably best to mix some of these with some S tier traits, because altogether these will be that will be the most effective kind of combination, as the A tier traits are still very good picks. So yeah, the best species builds will have a combination of A and S tier traits, depending on what specific kind of empire production you're going for. B tier, these are good traits that are effective for most empire builds. They may lack usefulness in certain game stages, or are just simply not as effective as the traits in A and S tier. So these are still good picks. If you're trying to be a little bit more specifically focused on one particular type of production that, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't do as much for you as bonuses to resource production that you have in A or S tier, then yeah, you might want to go for these ones. They're not bad traits, but they're just outclassed by those in A and S tier. C tier, mediocre traits that can be used for most empire builds but are outclassed by higher tiers in all stages of the game or in overall usefulness. More niche traits will be here and should largely be avoided. So these are the traits where you don't necessarily want to pick them because there are other ones in B, A, and S tier that give you better production bonuses for your resources. You can still pick them if you want to, but I would, as said, largely avoid them, especially when trying to min-max, because there are way better traits in the 3 tiers above C tier. D tier, bad traits that see benefit but only for specific niche builds, minor usefulness, weak effects, or too costly to use. So this is where traits will start to appear that they simply require too many trait points, and I don't recommend using them. Also, ones that don't have as good production bonuses as those even in C tier, but definitely those in B, A, and S tier. And definitely those that have a very short lifespan of usefulness. So, for example, it could be a trait that very early in the game is not very good, but gets better over time. However, once it becomes useful in the late game, there are way many more traits that are significantly more useful. So you pretty much don't want to pick these ones unless you are doing, as said, specific niche builds for fun. F tier, bad traits that should never be chosen outside role-playing. They have limited usefulness, they have unworthy effects, or they are too costly to use. So even worse than D tier, they either require way too many trait points for what they do, and overall do not give you too much to work with in terms of the actual bonuses that they give. So these are the ones that you pretty much always want to avoid unless you are doing a role-playing or very meme-worthy kind of Empire build. So with that being said, we're going to start off at the bottom with F tier, and then we're going to work our way up the tiers to the top where S tier will be last. Now, I did jot down a lot of notes on every aspect of each of these tier lists, so every trait I have notes on why it is ranked where it is, and I'm largely just going to be reading off of those and adding a little bit extra after the fact before we move on to the next trait. So starting off in F tier, the first one that we have is Extremely Adaptive. This gives you plus 20% habitability. It costs 4 trait points. This trait gets worse over time due to habitability to technology, traditions, and ascension perks that improve habitability, and terraforming completely nullifies the need for higher habitability on new worlds. This is only useful in the earliest portions of the game, making rapid expansion easier and starting colonies more productive due to having potentially happier populations. This usefulness drops off hard in the mid-game and may cause too much expansion, leading to economic collapse early on for those who are not paying attention. It's also way too costly for its effects. So, I think that sums it up pretty clear. There are technologies, and in particular one tradition that increases your native species habitability once you get them. There's also ascension perks that maybe don't directly contribute to habitability, but the flesh is weak is one of them. Once your pops are cyborgs, their habitability goes way up. So picking this becomes less useful over time because every game you play, you will get those technologies that increase your native species habitability. You will get that diplomacy tradition that increases your habitability. So there's really no reason to pick this over many other potential options. Also because it costs 4 trait points, this doesn't really do you very much. It's really only truly useful in those first 30 or 40 years of the game if you're trying to play really wide and colonize a lot of planets. But even then, this trait is just too costly even for that, because with using up those 4 trait points, you have to pick 2 red traits to in order to compensate for that. Second, we have Venerable, leader lifespan plus 75 years. This costs 4 trait points as well. This one also gets worse over time due to lifespan, technologies, traditions, and ascension perks improving leader lifespan. Can unintentionally lead to being stuck with a crappy ruler during the beginning of the game for an extended period of time, particularly with dictatorial or imperial authority. So not so much about the getting stuck with a crappy ruler part, which I'll get to in a bit, but this is largely another one that gets worse over time because you have technologies that increase leader lifespan as you progress through the game, and there's even a repeatable technology that increases leader lifespan, making this trait totally obsolete. There are traditions that increase leader lifespan, and there are ascension perks that improve leader lifespan. Most of them will improve your leader's lifespan. Another good example, the flesh is weak. gives your leaders about another 40 years of leader lifespan. In terms of traditions, there's one in the Harmony tree that also does that. So taking this right off the bat, again, it costs 4 trait points, and you're going to have to either pick non-adaptive or 2 other red traits to offset picking this just for having really long-living leaders. And there is the possibility that in the very beginning of the game, or even later on in the game, if you are using a dictatorial or imperial authority where your ruler only gets replaced when they die, your very first ruler could be crappy, or a very young ruler that gets voted into office or takes power when your current ruler dies could be crappy. There are such things as negative ruler traits, and they have a direct negative impact on your empire. So if you get stuck with that ruler and they live a ridiculously long time, you're stuck with them for a ridiculously long time unless you pay a substantial sum of influence to change your government's authority, which is just not worth it. Don't pick this trait. There are way better options out there. And third, we have Robust. This gives you plus 30% habitability and increases your leader lifespans by plus 30 years. It costs 7 trait points. This is available from the Biological Ascension path. It combines the effects of extremely adaptive and enduring/venerable into a single trait at an even higher cost, with bonuses that are borderline obsolete by the time the player has access to this trait due to technologies, traditions, and ascension perks, improving both values for your species. The player will also have more advanced terraforming technologies by this time, which again nullifies the reason to further increase species-based habitability. So, as said, this basically combines the previous 2 traits that I said are not worth it because they're ridiculously expensive and their bonuses do not have much use, especially in the later stages of the game, combines them into a single trait and makes that trait even more expensive. So everything I said earlier about the increases to habitability and leader lifespan applies here. What I forgot to mention with extremely adaptive is that the ability to terraform planets completely negates the need to increase your habitability of your native species by the mid or even the late game, when you actually start using terraforming and start using it more frequently, as every player should be doing, because you'll be looking at planets within your borders. If you simply cannot expand outwards, you're looking to expand inwards, either by building habitats or ring worlds, or colonizing planets that are still in your borders and still habitable. And you'll probably be terraforming a lot of those planets if they're good colony candidates. So this is not a good trait. Never pick it. Definitely not worth gene tailoring your species for it either, because by the time you get access to this trait, it's pretty late in the game. It'll be at least 100 years into the game. Okay, moving on. We have 5 traits in D tier, and the first one is Conformists. This gives your native species plus 25% governing ethics attraction, and it costs 2 trait points. This one gets worse over time because players will want to shift ethics at least once during the game, and this trait makes it more difficult to do so. Also, a high 2-point cost for its overall effect means this trait is drastically inferior compared to others, especially traits that increase production whilst also costing 2 points. So the traits that come to mind immediately that also cost 2 points and increase actual production are things like thrifty, intelligent, and industrious. Why you would want to pick this trait over either of those 3 would be beyond me, unless you're just doing it for the memes. And as I said, there is almost always at least 1 point in every game where you're going to want to shift your governing ethics so that you can take different civics or benefit from different bonuses of changing your ethics. So say, for example, you're doing a fanatic, xenophobe, and pacifist run where you use inward perfection and agrarian ideal to rush unity and get some really quick ascension perks. And say once you get about 4 or 5 ascension perks online, you want to shift your ethics either towards militarism or spiritualism, and that will allow you to take the fanatic purifier civic. Taking this trait actually makes it more difficult to do that, and you have to do a lot more within your empire, potentially severely damaging its current production values, just to try and make it more likely that your pops will adopt different ethics, allowing you to embrace a new faction to change your ethics. So, not a good pick. Nomadic, plus 50% migration speed, minus 25% resettlement costs. This costs 1 trait point. This trait helps new colonies get more pops more quickly, increasing that colony's development speed. However, pops tend to migrate from developed colonies with more powerful buildings, which reduces overall resource output when a pop moves from a tier 4 building to a tier 2. Also, this can reduce resource output with 0 kickback if the player has migration treaties and the pop migrates to a different empire. The effect of this trait, increasing the speed a colony develops, is also heavily outclassed by the rapid breeders trait. Growing more pops more quickly is far superior to migrating pops. So my notes on this one are pretty self-explanatory. At first glance, yeah, it's like, yeah, this will help my new colonies develop faster because my pops will migrate to it, and they'll complete their migration faster. Well, in doing so, they could be moving off of, for example, your capital world where they're on, say, a power plant 5, and they migrate to a brand new colony that only has a power plant 2 for them to work at, or even worse, a basic power plant of all things. So having this trait helps your pops move off of developed colonies with better buildings more quickly, and they will migrate away to empires that have a habitable world that will sustain them. They'll migrate into that empire, and you get nothing in return for it. So this is not a good pick whatsoever, especially considering there's way better ones for a single trait point. So third in D tier, we have Resilient. This gives your pops, your armies in particular, plus 100% garrison health and a plus 50% fortification defense bonus. This costs 1 trait point. This trait is only useful in role-playing. This trait does nothing except improve army defenses, which can be overcompensated by an attacker having significantly more armies regardless of your garrison. Still more valuable to take strong to increase army damage, which is useful in retaking your occupied colonies as well as attacking enemy colonies. Also, picking this trait means you're intending to always be on the defensive, which is the wrong way to win wars. Final note, each planet can only have so many armies garrisoned on it relative to planet size. Attacking armies can be huge, numbering hundreds or thousands of armies. So my notes on this one are quite self-explanatory. These help your defending armies. That's it. Why you would pick this over something like Strong that increases army damage, where your armies will get a permanent bonus no matter if they're attacking or defending, or if they're taking back a previously occupied colony of yours, or if they're taking back an enemy colony that you conquered and then they took back and then now you're reconquering it, blah, blah, blah. Why you would pick this over something like that is beyond me. It's just very dumb. It's not a good trait whatsoever. If you're memeing it up, by all means. The big thing is that this trait is only useful when you're on the defensive, and if you're playing on the defensive, you're essentially doing something wrong because you're not going to win wars by letting somebody attack your 25 tile worlds with 25 defense armies when they have 250 assault armies. You're not going to fend them off whatsoever, and you're not going to win wars. They're getting war score for occupying your planets. You're getting nothing for retaking those planets. Next up, fourth trait, we have Very Strong. This increases army damage by plus 40% and minerals production by plus 10%. It costs 3 points. This gives a powerful boost to army damage and a moderate boost to minerals production. Overall decent bonuses, however the cost of this trait is simply too much for what it does. Minerals output can be increased in so many ways, technology, robots, buildings, that the extra 10% is negligible in the later stages of the game. The army damage is more useful throughout most of the game, but again drops off due to traditions, technologies, and even army attachments and generals being able to do this while the player picks better traits. And another thing I didn't mention is you don't necessarily need a trait that drastically increases army damage when you can just build more armies. So the 10% to minerals is kind of nice when you stack it with numerous other things that increase minerals production, especially in the later points of the game when minerals really are king. But you're better off taking a cheaper trait like Industrious, which only costs 2 points and gives you 15% minerals production. So why you would pick this one over that one would be kind of dumb if you're trying to maximize your productivity. As I said before, that this trait would largely just be for the memes. Lastly, we have Slow Breeders. This is a red trait. Growth speed is reduced by 15%. It costs -1 point. This is not a good trait due to slowing down pop growth, which slows down colony development and production. It also only gives back 1 trait point, which knocks it down several tiers. This single point return for the overall impact of this trait's negative effect is just not worth picking this trait over many others. Players who want to build more robots can simply resettle organic pops onto other colonies where needed, or do migration treaties with other empires and replace organic pops that have migrated with a robot pop. So yes, I know this trait is used in the one planet strategy, but that's pretty much the only time you want to use it. Even if you're playing as a materialist and you plan on using a lot of robots, if you're picking this, you are gimping yourself. The reason why you pick it with one planet strategy is you're intentionally trying to limit how many organic pops you're getting. You don't want to limit the amount of pops you're getting if you're playing any other way, even if it's very tall, because more pops means more production. More production means you have a better empire, essentially. Even with a tall empire, what you're trying to do with more production is you're trying to get more science more quickly. The more pops you have, the more science you'll be generating, the faster you tech up, the faster you get an edge over your enemies. So this trait is not a good red pick to get a single trait point back. As I said, it's only used in one planet strategy. Apart from that, do not pick it. Moving up to C tier, and we have quite a few in this one. Starting off with Adaptive. This increases your pop's habitability by plus 10%, and it costs 2 points. Similar to Extremely Adaptive, this gets worse over time due to habitability increases from technology, traditions, and ascension perks, and terraforming becoming more available in the later stages of the game. This is still better than Extremely Adaptive due to the lower cost in trait points, but still very much outclassed by other traits requiring 2 points, which increase species resource production. So as said before, with Conformists, which also costs 2 points, why you would pick this over something like Industrious or Thrifty or Intelligent is beyond me, and is just not a good idea. More production is better than simply having more habitability. Next up, we have Conservationist. This reduces consumer goods cost by 20%. It costs 1 trait point, and my notes on it are as follows. Reducing minerals being used to maintain your organic pops can see use when stacking with other effects, but compared to other traits that give superior bonuses for a single point, this one falls way behind on its positive influence. Consumer goods can be reduced with no penalty by completing harmony traditions. Lowering either living standards for a species or enslaving them will also reduce consumer goods cost, but can be compensated with certain happiness bonuses or slave output bonuses. This is ultimately outclassed by 1 point traits in B, A, and S tier. So as my notes said, it's just not as good as increasing your overall output of minerals. On a basic species, essentially all this is doing is reducing the cost of maintaining your organic pops by 0.1 mineral per month. Now it sounds like that's a big deal once you get up to like 200 pops or something like that, which translates to plus 20 minerals. But if you think about it, it would be better if you get it so that those 200 pops, or however many are mining for minerals, it would be better if you give those pops plus 15% extra minerals production, or even plus 5% habitability to give them plus 5% more production in whatever resource they are getting for you. So this is just not a terribly good pick. You can grab it in certain niche builds, especially if you are drastically stacking up reductions in consumer goods cost, and you're going for something like Utopian Abundance living standards, which increases the consumer goods cost by twice their normal amount. Third, we have Strong. This increases army damage by plus 20% and minerals production by plus 5%. This one costs a single trait point, and it is better bang for your buck than Very Strong, but this trait still falls behind many others for the same cost in trait points. Plus 5% minerals is not a noticeable bonus, especially in the late game with robots and technologies and high-level buildings being used. Bonus army damage can be gained from technologies, traditions, and army attachments, and even general leaders, without having to use a trait point that would be better used by something else. So honestly, doing something like increasing happiness by 5% to give you a plus 5% happiness bonus increases production for all your resources potentially by another 5%. This only increases minerals production by 5%. And again, the bonus to army damage is negligible when you can just build more armies. And as said, in every game you'll see that you complete technologies and traditions and can give army attachments and assign generals that give good army damage bonuses. So I do not recommend this trait. over many, 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 many others. And next up we have Enduring. This increases leader lifespan by 15 years. It costs a single trait point. This helps your initial leaders live longer lives, which can result in high-level leaders really early. This trait drops off in usefulness as the game progresses due to technologies, traditions, and ascension perks that increase leader lifespan. However, the gains from early high-level leaders can result in a minor snowball effect for a player's empire. This often only causes leaders to gain one more level before actually dying, though. So I actually dropped this trait down from B tier. The longer lifespan of 15 years leads to maybe one extra level before the leader is dead, and those are just insignificant gains overall. So an extra level on your scientists is pretty nice because you can complete those anomalies and special projects sooner. But on something like your ruler, not a huge deal. Plus 3% more unity. Your governor, your admiral, and your general, also not a huge deal, especially considering your admiral and general might not even be engaging in battles, and they're just not making use of the extra long lifespan by gaining more XP. So there's way better picks for a single trait point than Enduring. Okay, so our fifth trait is Repugnant. Ruler opinion impact minus 25. This returns one trait point. This causes AI empires to have a lower opinion of you. It's not a terrible selection if going with fanatic xenophobe ethics or playing as a fanatic purifier or devouring swarm, as the AI will already dislike you by a fair amount. Any other time, this trait is a severe hindrance. Empires are more likely to close borders to you if they don't have a neutral or positive opinion towards you, and they are less likely to form non-aggression pacts, research agreements, defensive pacts, or even accept subjugation through diplomatic means. Until you can genetically modify your species to remove this trait, you will be dealing with its negative effects for a very long time, usually until mid-game or even late game. For the cost of this trait returning 1 point, there are other options that have nowhere near the negative consequences. So, missing out on the potential diplomacy options with AI empires is quite huge, especially with AI empires that are for some reason out-teching you, and you want to try to get research agreements with them. You're less likely to do it if your ruler is repugnant, or if your pops are repugnant, I should say. If you have a ruler in power that when they were generated in your leader pool, if the repugnant trait was one of your species traits by the time the leader was generated in the pool, and they have this trait and they are made your ruler, it's an automatic minus 25 opinion from AI empires. So it's, as said, it's harder to do things like research agreements, non-aggression pacts, stuff that you could actually benefit from people, not attacking you, or potentially getting more technologies completed more quickly. This is not a terribly good red trait pick to get a single trait point back. So most of the time I don't recommend it. However, as said before, if you're already playing as even partial xenophobe or fanatic xenophobe, or as devouring swarm / fanatic purifiers, you'll already have a pretty negative opinion from AI empires because of those things. So you can stack this on there, and it's essentially a free trait point because your fanatic purifiers, everybody already dislikes you by minus 1,000. What's another 25 points? Okay, next up we have Fleeting. This reduces leader lifespan by 10 years. It costs minus 1 point, so it returns one. It can be quickly compensated by the mind and body tradition in the Harmony tree and even early technologies. The drawback is players may find their first batches of leaders all dying off before their influence has sufficiently stockpiled to replace them all, and this can severely hamper productivity in those early years when it's most important not to be. Also forces players to try and focus certain technologies or traditions at the beginning to avoid a massive dying off of initial leaders, just to try and prevent such setbacks, instead of prioritizing better choices that will see greater gains in the early game, which can carry over well into the game's future. So I think I largely covered the issues with this trait. Having your leaders die off before you're ready to replace them, either because you don't have enough influence or you don't have a worthy replacement, can actually be a significant setback. Forcing you to spend influence when you don't want to, just to replace your leaders, as opposed to, say, colonizing a new planet or building a new frontier outpost. So not a terribly good pick when trying to maximize your empire's productivity. Wasteful. This increases consumer goods cost by plus 20%. It costs minus 1 point, so it returns one as well. This is a decent red trait as it is almost completely compensated for by finishing the Harmony Traditions tree. It can also be compensated by reducing living standards, which adds a small happiness penalty. The effects of this trait can be made worse by improving living standards, namely up to Utopian Abundance, but the impact on minerals production is rarely more than a few dozen per month by the late stages of the game. This is a good pick for returning a single trait point that gets better over time. I actually dropped this one down from B tier. It's a very small reduction in minerals production, but it's still a reduction. Especially in the mid and late game, minerals are king. Minerals are probably the biggest limiting factor to expansion in the early portions of the game because you're trying to wait for enough minerals to construct that new building, construct that new frontier outpost, construct a colony ship, whatever. And that carries over definitely into the late game when you need enough minerals to be constantly building up ships and going to war. So it's still an okay pick. As said, completing the Harmony Traditions tree decreases consumer goods cost by 15%. So the effects of this trait rounds out to only plus 5% extra consumer goods cost. But that won't be happening for quite some time. So it's best to just not pick this red trait, especially when there are other red traits out there that would be a better pick for returning a single trait point. Next up, second last one, we have Weak. This reduces army damage by 20% and minerals production by 5%. It costs -1 point, so it returns 1. It's a minor reduction in minerals, and it's just not good. The reduction in army damage is not an issue, as Supremacy Tradition Warrior Mindset increases army damage by 25%, overcompensating for this trait's negative impact. Of course, this can also be overcompensated by a high-level general, army attachments, certain technologies, so on and so forth. The reduced minerals output is temporary at best, as powered exoskeletons, which can be the first engineering technology available, does away with it entirely, and further bonuses such as mineral processing plants overcompensate for the penalty. Army damage is also compensated by having larger numbers of armies, as I've said previously regarding increased army damage for things like strong and very strong. It's a decent red trait for returning a single point that gets better over time. And this one I also dropped down from B tier. The reduced minerals slows down early game expansion and late game productivity. You don't feel the effects of this one later on in the game, but in the early game, less minerals coming in right off the hop means that you're not expanding nearly as quickly. You're not getting those minerals nearly as quickly. You're not constructing those buildings on your homeworld as early as you should be. So, not the best red pick, but it's still an okay one, and as said, it does get better over time because its negative effects do get overcompensated for in numerous ways. And for the last trait in C tier, we have Slow Learners. This reduces leader XP by -25%. It costs -1 point, so it returns 1. Can be compensated by leader enhancement policies, but those are fairly far down the society tech tree and cause leaders to be quite expensive to recruit. This is mostly detrimental to scientists in the early game, as they will not be able to complete higher level anomalies or special projects as quickly, which slows down technology progress and resource gathering via space stations. This also hurts Unity output as the ruler levels up more slowly, which is not an acceptable drawback. This trait's negative effects start to be less noticeable as the game goes on and higher level leaders are available right upon recruiting. However, for its return of 1 point, there are better red traits with less detrimental effects. So, simply having your rulers not level up as quickly can have fairly far-reaching effects. As said, though, it does get better over time. Actually, I didn't necessarily say that, but this does kind of get better over time because you could pick a leader enhancement policy, which gives your leaders higher XP gains. This does make them more expensive to recruit, but later on in the game, by the time you're getting those kind of technologies, recruiting new leaders is probably only about 15 or 20 influence anyways. And you'll be recruiting them at higher levels due to completing traditions like polytechnic education, for example. So it's still an okay red trait to go with, but it's more detrimental for a longer period of time than other red trait picks. So if you're trying to just get that 1 per point back, or that 1 trait point back, I definitely recommend other ones. There are definitely worse red traits, but Okay, so moving on to B tier, the first trait we have in B tier is Agrarian. This increases food output by plus 15% and it costs 2 trait points. Increased food output leads to less reliance on hydroponics farm buildings or modules in spaceports in the early game. Also leads to higher growth speed bonuses when a specialized food colony is developing or fully develops. Faster growth can lead to more pops more quickly, which means more production. Usefulness starts to fall off a little in the late game as energy and minerals become the primary resources due to players requiring larger fleets. Due to this, it is ranked lower than other traits that have a 2-point cost. So I think my notes pretty much cover it. In the early and middle stages, more food output can be good as you get a better growth speed bonus from having more food production once your stockpiles are completely full. However, it's just not as useful as either thrifty or industrious, especially later on in the game when you really need more energy to keep your large fleets maintained, and you need more minerals so that you can build more ships. Still an okay pick though, and that's why it's in B tier. Definitely better than a lot of the other options in C, D, and F tier. Next up we have Communal, Happiness, plus 5%. This costs 1 trait point. Extra happiness can lead to a slight boost in production for all resources. Colonies have a happiness cap depending on their habitability, so this trait is not as entirely useful as others that cost only 1 point, but still a decent choice and better than those in lower tiers. Also can help combat unrest from slaves in authoritarian empires and make them sufficiently more productive. This ultimately gets worse over time as there are other ways of increasing happiness, namely harmony traditions through adoption and acquiring the Paradise Dome building. So, as said, adopting harmony traditions increases citizen pop happiness. Also, adopting the tradition, I forget what it's called, that gives you the Paradise Dome, is another way to increase happiness. You can also get a ruler that has the Champion of the People trait. That gives a happiness bonus throughout your empire. But, you know, that's less reliable as completing those harmony traditions. So as said, yes, for 1 point you could increase your production for all your resources by up to another 5%, which is it's a pretty decent bonus for a single trait point. If you're playing an authoritarian empire, you might not necessarily want to pick this one so much as just ones that increase overall production. But if you do take this when you are using slaves, either as an authoritarian or xenophobic empire, actually a xenophobic one wouldn't work. Because it's just your native species. So just an authoritarian empire, this could help combat unrest as your slaves will be a little bit happier. Okay, third in B tier, we have Quick Learners. This increases leader XP gain by plus 25% and it costs 1 trait point. Faster leveling leaders can be useful in the beginning of the game for the same reasons that enduring can be useful in the beginning of the game. This trait drops off in usefulness as leaders become inherently higher level upon recruitment during the game's progression, and the player gets access to leader enhancement policies which offer the same kind of bonus for higher recruitment costs. This often only causes leaders to gain an extra level before dying, especially in the early portions of the game where you don't have bonuses to their lifespan. So, same thing as enduring pretty much, although it is kind of a better pick than enduring. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for the most part, but it's still a decent pick if you're trying to really get the leg up with some high-level leaders early on in the game. Charismatic, ruler opinion impact plus 25. This costs 1 trait point. This is actually a pretty good trait, and that's why it's in B tier. Higher AI opinion can lead to AI empires being more amenable to non-aggression or defensive pacts, and fledgling empires being more willing to accept diplomatic subjugation as your vassal or tributary. AI will also be less likely to close borders, allowing you to freely explore and survey their space. AI empires that are stronger than yourself are less likely to attack you and more likely to develop a protective attitude, possibly guaranteeing your independence, which can cause hostile AI empires to not attack you at all. So my notes pretty much cover the benefits of taking this particular trait. Not as good as things that, increase, for example, production bonuses and the like, but if you're going for a more diplomatic approach in your particular playthrough, it's still a pretty good trait to go with. AI empires liking you more despite having, a different ethos than them, or possibly even some slight xenophobia, which will reduce their opinion. This will kind of cancel it out. Okay, next up we have Talented. Leader skill levels +1. This costs 1 trait point. This gets worse over time as certain traditions increase leader levels during game progression. Higher level leaders at the beginning can see significant gains by increasing building build speed, reducing costs of clearing tile blockers, increasing unity generation, and being able to study higher level anomalies and special projects sooner than other empires. I dropped this trait down from A tier. The extra leader level was not a significant benefit to overall production or research speeds, and it loses value over time. So it's still a decent pick, kind of like the Quick Learners one if you want to try to get some higher level leaders really, really early on in the game and give you a bit of a leg up on doing things like completing anomalies and like with your scientists. However, as said, this really loses value over time. You have traditions like Polytechnic Education that increase all of your leader levels upon recruitment, and then you have other ones that increase the levels of your governors, the level of your admirals, so on and so forth. And it's just not nearly as good a pick as some others in A and S tier, but it's still a pretty decent pick overall. Not as bad, not even close to as bad as some in F and D tier, for example. So starting to get into some of the red traits, we have sedentary, migration speed -50%, resettlement cost +25%. This costs -1 point, so it returns 1. This is a decent red trait, especially for tall empires where a migrating pop causes a downturn in overall production numbers due to leaving a high-tier building for a low-tier building on an undeveloped colony. This can also slow the process of pops migrating to other empires, which sees 0 productivity return for the player. Increased resettlement cost can be a bit more of an issue for wide empires, but higher influence gains offsets this. So, pretty much the opposite of nomadic, which is all the way down in D tier. Having longer migration speeds means that your pops are not moving off of your developed colonies where they're probably on a high tier building, producing quite a lot of resources for you. They're not moving off of that building as quickly. So it's actually a decent pick for a red trait when you're trying to just return a single trait point. Decadent. Happiness without slaves, -10%. This costs -1 point, so it returns 1. This is a good red trait for authoritarian empires, as happiness penalty is easily overcome on any colony by adding a single slave-oriented building, a hydroponics farm, a mining network, or a slave processing facility. Not a great pick for non-authoritarian empires, as slavery is often prohibited with other ethos, but in the right circumstances, this is a good red trait to return a single point. Xenophobe empires allow slavery, but is usually restricted to enslaving another species, so players likely experience the happiness penalty for a portion of the game's start. Therefore, this is not recommended for xenophobic empires. It's a good red trait pick that gets better over time, and as said, it's totally compensated for by making sure that there is at least one enslaved pop on each of your colonies. So, self-explanatory, an obvious pick for authoritarian empires that are definitely making use of slavery. That happiness penalty can be overcompensated by either having a slave pop or by increasing happiness throughout the empire through things like adopting harmony traditions and getting the Paradise Dome, etc., etc., etc. Solitary, happiness -5%. This costs -1 point, so it does return 1. Happiness penalty can be dangerous with slaver empires. However, this is easily compensated for by adopting harmony traditions tree or having a ruler with champion of the people trait, as I've said before. The downtick in overall production is temporary at best. The Paradise Dome buildings will undo the penalty altogether. It's a decent pick for returning a single point that gets better over time. Probably not the best red trait pick to go with. In fact, it's definitely not, but still a decent one if you don't want to go with the usual go-to red trait picks to return that single trait point back for the reasons specified. Okay, and lastly we have Fertile. This increases growth speed by +30% and happiness by +5%. It costs 4 trait points. This one is available for completing the biological ascension path. It's a major boost to pop growth, which will see late colonies develop very quickly, and happiness bonus increases overall production across the board. It's somewhat expensive, but the overall effects are worth the cost, useful in any empire that completes biological ascension and still has room to expand. I dropped this down from S tier because by the time you get this trait, it's pretty late in the game and it's not as useful as traits that just increase production. Sure, increasing the growth speed will in effect also increase production because you get more pops fully grown and online more quickly, but you're still just better off having those pops giving those pops production bonuses instead of growth speed bonuses, because they'll be pumping out more resources for you, once they are in fact fully grown. Alright, so we're getting to the good stuff by bumping up to A tier now, and the first trait in A tier is Thrifty. This increases energy production by plus 15%, and it costs 2 trait points. Increased energy output from organic pops allows for more space stations and ships from the start to the end of the game. This also helps with robot maintenance. It can help play for Artisan Troop patronage or Curator Insight earlier than other empires, giving additional bonuses to Unity or Science. So my notes pretty much cover all the good stuff from having more energy output. This is a really good trait, especially if you are intending to use a lot of robots. Then you can use your organic pops on power plants, since robots and droids do have pretty significant penalties to energy production. You can keep your organic pops on power plants and science buildings, and keep your robots and droids on the likes of mining networks and hydroponics farms. And if your organic pops have Thrifty, you'll be able to maintain more robots. So it's a good pick. Second, we have Intelligent. This increases physics, society, and engineering science output by plus 10%. It costs 2 trait points. This will help any empire tech up faster in all branches, giving bigger advantages as time goes on due to technology being so powerful. Pretty self-explanatory here. If you want bonuses to the production of science in all 3 areas from your organic pops that are on science labs, pick this trait. There's really no reason not to. Technology is really powerful. If you can get a leg up over other empires and have better technology faster than them, this is a simple no-brainer. Now, the next 3 traits are kind of similar. We have natural physicists, natural sociologists, and natural engineers. I'll go through them one at a time, though. Natural physicist, increase physics output by plus 15%. It only costs 1 trait point. Extra physics is quite good throughout the game, as you get better power plants for generating energy and better reactors for powering ships. This also helps complete administrative AI and sentient AI for higher research speed bonuses in all branches. Several other important techs like automatic exploration protocols are in the physics tree. Finally, physics has useful repeatables such as shield harmonics, gravitational analysis, flash coolant, focusing arrays, and applied superconductivity. All of those I highly recommend you research when you are in the late stages of the game. This is a solid pick for players who want to round out their empires with an extra boost to science. I actually moved this up from B tier. More science is good. It's as good as the other traits that increase your science. Natural sociologists, increased society output by plus 15%. This also costs 1 point. Extra society is great in the early and middle game, but does see some drop off in usefulness towards the late game. There are major society technologies that can cause a spike in overall empire productivity and power as the game progresses. Most importantly, increases Unity output from higher tier Unity buildings. The auto-curating vault, the Hypercomps Forum, the Ministry of Benevolence, and it provides terraforming capabilities. Useful repeatables increase slave resource output, army health and damage, leader capacity, and core system limit. This is a solid pick for players who want to add an extra boost to their empire's science or specifically rush Unity buildings for traditions and ascension perks. This one I also moved up from B tier because more science is good, and it's a solid pick. There are also other major technologies in the society tree, namely things like the collective self and the living state, that increase your empire's leader capacity and the influence that you get from factions. So more society output is good. Completing those techs is good. You also get things that such as your empire capital complex sooner. And there's numerous other things in there too. Galactic markets, I do believe, for the Galactic Stock Exchange. The list goes on. Natural engineers. This increases engineering output by plus 15%. It costs 1 point as well. Extra engineering is very good due to gaining access to bigger ships, spaceports, robots, and mega engineering faster. It also unlocks and upgrades strikecraft faster, which are a good deterrent against hostile AI empires considering attacking players. Engineering also sees many useful repeatables in the late game with increased ship hull points, armor, faster building construction, and increased kinetic, explosive, and strikecraft damage and attack speeds. This is a better choice over natural physicists or sociologists due to the extremely crucial unlockable technologies that are available in the engineering tree, namely the ones that I mentioned earlier: access to bigger ships, cruisers and battleships, bigger, and this also gives you bigger spaceports, access to robots, droids, and synthetics, and mega engineering. Plus, you also get really useful weapons like Strikecraft, which, while not good in practice, they're good for equipping on things like defense stations and your carrier style of ships if you're just sitting back and keeping hostile AI at bay with your seemingly strong fleet power. Okay, next up we have non-adaptive. This is the only red trait in A tier. It decreases habitability by -10%, and it costs -2 points, so it gives you back 2 trait points. This trait gets better over time as habitability penalty is compensated entirely from dynamic ecomorphism, diplomacy tradition, and numerous technologies in the society tree that increase habitability to overcompensate for it. As the only red trait that returns 2 points, this is the optimal choice for increasing trait picks for any native species. Yeah, this is my go-to pick when I want to really stack on some major traits such as thrifty and industrious and intelligent, or just 2 of those 3. Non-adaptive is a go-to pick. As said, it gets better over time because that negative habitability modifier is easily compensated for with so many technologies and the diplomacy tradition, dynamic ecomorphism, plus terraforming later on to terraform planets into the same climate as your home world, and this trait becomes a complete non-issue. It might slow down some expansion in the early game, but that's highly unlikely as you're probably just being more picky about the kind of planets you're colonizing. You still want the high habitability but large amounts of planet tiles sort of colonies. Lastly, we have Erudite. This increases physics, society, and engineering science by +20% and leader skill levels by +1. It costs 5 trait points. This combines and improves intelligent and talented for good science output plus increased leader bonuses. These effects would typically make it S tier, however the high cost in points drops it down to A tier. It's still a great pick for science-focused species and colonies that have completed the biological ascension path. So as said, this is a great way to really boost up your science output. It gives your leaders even more levels upon recruiting them, so your leaders will probably be level 5 by this point because you have a lot of traditions completed upon getting biological ascension path finished with, and once you gene tailor a lot of pops with this erudite trait, you're probably going to see all of your leaders, if not most of them, being recruited at level 5, and you're going to see your science production increase by a pretty noticeable tick. And finally, we are up to S tier, starting with Rapid Breeders. Growth speed plus 15%. This costs 1 trait point. Increased pop growth speed means more fully grown pops more quickly, which leads to faster production. Colonies will develop faster, leading to much greater snowballing in the middle or late stages of the game. This is a cheap trait that works wonderful for any species, regardless of empire build, in all stages of the game. So my notes pretty much sum it up. More growth speed. You can pick this at the very beginning of the game, so you'll see its benefits from the start to the end of the game. Obviously, you may want to consider replacing it with the fertile trait if you complete the biological ascension path. However, you could still leave this one on for only costing a single trait point. It's still a pretty dang good bonus. It'll help your late game colonies develop more quickly, offering pretty good production bonuses. This is a very cheap trait for what it does. For a single point, it's fantastic. Next up, we have Industrious. Minerals plus 15%. This costs 2 trait points. Minerals tend to be the largest limiting factor of expansion in the early game, so increasing minerals production will help empires increase production, expand, and become more powerful more quickly. Minerals are also one of the major determining factors in shipbuilding capabilities by the middle and late stages of the game. More minerals allows for players to build more ships, including more powerful ships supporting expensive technologies. This is a useful trait in all stages of the game for any empire build. Later on in pretty much every game you play, once you get those extra 2 trait points from completing the genetic modification technologies in the society tree, and if you have not gone up the even if you have gone up the biological ascension path, this is pretty much a go-to pick. Increasing your minerals production by plus 15%, it's a significant bonus. It's more than any other trait will give you for minerals production, and it stacks well with others that increase minerals production. More minerals means you can build more ships, which is a major factor in the late portions of the game, especially against crisis events or awakened empires, where you need to replenish your losses as soon as possible. So our third trait in S tier is Deviance. This is a red trait. Governing Ethics Attraction, minus 15%. It costs -1 point, so it returns 1 point. This is the best red trait to return a single trait point. It combats ethics attraction towards governing ethics players no longer want in the middle or late stages of the game. Optimally, players will want to shift their ethics at least once during any game, usually due to no longer needing unity bonuses from pacifism or spiritualism. This trait is essentially a free trait point return, as its effects are, in fact, good, useful in any Empire build. So for the exact reasons that Conformists is a crappy trait, Deviance is an excellent trait. There's almost no reason to not pick it in an Empire build where you need to get back a single trait point, because you're just picking a couple, like 1 or 2 extra higher costing traits to increase your Empire's production. It's a good pick. You can gene modify it out to get rid of it completely, but I highly recommend, even if you have selected it as one of your native species traits, leave it on for the entirety of the game, as you'll just have an easier time shifting your governing ethics, having new factions pop up that you can then embrace to shift the ethics of your entire empire and make use of those different ethics bonuses. So the last 2 traits in S tier are from completing the biological ascension path. We have first up Nerve Stapled. This increases minerals and food by plus 10%. However, Unity minus 50%, Energy minus 50%, Physics, Society, and Engineering Science minus 75%, and pops with this trait are not affected by Happiness. This trait costs 3 points. This is a good biological ascension trait for increasing food and minerals output, however sees limited usefulness due to increasing production for only these 2 resources and having a huge negative impact for anything else. Nevertheless, it still increases production where you need it. This is a great trait for authoritarian or xenophobe empires using slaves, as slaves will no longer be generating unrest thanks to no longer being affected by Happiness. I actually moved this one up from B tier. It has good production bonuses, and it also eliminates unhappy slaves for slaver empires. And for all of this, it actually has a pretty cheap cost in points. It only costs 3 trait points and gives you better effects overall than, say, Very Strong, which also costs 3 trait points and doesn't do nearly as much. So yeah, this is a very good pick to genetically modify even your native species, whether or not you're using slaves. You can still genetically modify your pops that are on planets specialized for minerals and food, and you will see the production for those 2 resources go up pretty dang high. Lastly, we have Delicious. This increases pop food output by plus 100%. It costs 3 trait points. Livestock generate a decent amount of food, roughly the same as mid-tier hydroponics farms. Tailoring livestock with the Delicious trait can cause a massive spike in food production, resulting in major pop growth bonuses, allowing developing colonies to grow significantly faster and increase resource production in short order. This sees limited usefulness due to requiring xenophobia that allows enslaving xenopops and turning them into livestock, plus completing the biological ascension path. Any empire that does so, however, will see huge returns. Also, this is one of the cheaper bio-ascension traits. It only costs 3 trait points. This one's also really good for a devouring swarm or any other empire that can purge pops through processing, which is like keeping those pops around as livestock, but you actually purge them, so they do disappear. Pops that are being processed generate more food than livestock, I do believe. So gene tailoring them to be delicious further increases the food bonuses you gain from those pops up until the point where they are purged. This is actually a fantastic trait to put on those filthy xenos that you just want to eat for the decadence and happiness of your native species. I highly recommend using it to its fullest extent. And that'll sum it up for the traits tier list. This was naturally a pretty long video. Nothing new there. Yeah, there will be a couple others just like this one for the current version of Console Edition, and I will be revising these once we get updated to the 2.2 version. I want to thank all of you for watching this. If you stuck through it, hopefully this gives you a really good idea of the kind of species traits you want to pick for your native species when you start a new game and you're really trying to min-max and make the best empire you can. Don't forget to check out the links in the description below, namely the link to Stefan Anand's channel, who helped me out quite a bit with this tier list. Also my Twitch channel, where I stream Stellaris Console Edition at least once per week, typically on Tuesdays. My Twitter feed, which is a great way to keep in touch with me, and I'll post important announcements, such as if I have to cancel or postpone a stream. And lastly, the Discord channel, where lots of my viewers are a part of it. We're getting pretty close to 100 members, so if you want to drop in and talk about Stellaris Console Edition, or even set up a multiplayer game, we have people on Xbox and PS4 in there. Check those links in the description out. This is Mobius Y talking about Stellaris Console Edition, signing off for now. Thank you very much for watching.